Because here's what my son-in-law threw in the recycling bin at my daughter's house last October, in front of everyone who'd come to help them move. My late husband's hand-carved memory box. The one Roy spent 3 winters making in the garage. And here's what my daughter found when she finally asked him to explain himself, sobbing into the phone at midnight. "Mom, what did he throw away? What was inside it?" I've been sitting with that question for months now. I'm going to answer it properly. My name is Sylvia Oakes. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 32 years as a school librarian in Guelph, Ontario, which means I know how to be quiet when it matters, and I know how to tell a story when it needs telling. I know the difference between a book worth keeping and one that gets weeded from the shelf. Roy always said I had a gift for knowing what lasts. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know I'd need that gift for something like this. Roy passed 2 years ago February, a Thursday morning in the middle of a snowstorm. The kind that makes the whole city go soft and muffled, and the silence afterward felt like the whole world had turned down its volume. 41 years. We'd moved to Guelph from Sudbury when our daughter Lily was 3, and we'd built everything there. The house on Waterloo Avenue with the drafty back porch we kept meaning to fix. The garden he'd spent 2 decades coaxing into something worth looking at. The garage where he kept his tools in an order that made no sense to anyone but him. Roy was a carpenter by trade, but he was a craftsman by nature, which are 2 different things. He built cabinets for other people's kitchens for 30 years. But the pieces he made for himself, for us, those were different. Slower. Made on weekend mornings with the radio on low and coffee going cold on the workbench. He built our kitchen table. He built the bookshelves in the front room. He built a cradle for Lily that she still has in her attic somewhere, or at least she did, 3 years before he died. When we both knew the heart was giving him more trouble than it should, Roy started a project he didn't tell me much about. He'd disappear into the garage after supper, and I'd hear the sander going. The careful sound of a man doing something he meant to do right. I asked him once what he was making. He smiled and said, "A box. For keeping things in. Just leave me to it, Seal." I left him to it. The box appeared on our bedroom dresser the November before he went into hospital for the last time. Maple he'd used, with dovetail corners and a lid that fit so precisely it made a little exhale of air when you pressed it closed. On the top he'd carved a simple thing, 2 Carolinian wrens, the kind we'd had nesting on our back porch for years, facing each other on a branch. He'd rubbed the whole thing with linseed oil until it glowed like something lit from inside. I didn't ask what it was for, he didn't say, he just set it there and we both let it be. After Roy died, I found out what it was for. He'd left a note inside it, folded on top of everything else, in his blocky practical handwriting. The note said, "Syl, everything in here is for Lily. She'll know what to do with it when the time is right. Don't let anyone rush you. Put it somewhere safe. I love you. R." I sat on the edge of the bed, and I held that note for a long time. Inside the box, a letter Roy had written to Lily, long, 2 pages front and back, in the careful printing he used when he wanted to make sure his handwriting was readable, sealed in an envelope that said on the front, "For Lily, when she needs it most." A small gold locket that had been his mother's, the one she'd given him when he turned 18, and told him to give it to the woman he'd marry someday, which he'd given me, and which I'd worn for 20 years before the clasp broke, and I'd put it in a drawer, and somehow it had made its way into Roy's hands when he went to make this box. And underneath the letter and the locket, a passbook for a credit union account in Lily's name. Roy had been putting money aside for years, the way he did everything, quietly and with patience. Not enormous sums. $50 here, $100 after a good month. Every Christmas bonus from the cabinetry shop. Every time he sold a piece of furniture he'd made for himself and talked himself into letting go. The total in that account was just over $31,000. I sat there for a very long time. I thought about what he'd said once, years ago, when Lily had just finished her social work degree and was starting her first job and worried about money. Roy had said, "She'll be fine, Syl. She's got her head on straight. I'm just going to make sure she's got a floor under her, too." I'd thought he meant general fatherly confidence. He'd meant something much more literal. I didn't tell Lily right away. Something in Roy's note made me feel like the timing needed to be right, and the time was not right yet. She was in the thick of her grief in those first months, and then she was relocating for work, moving from Guelph to Calgary, to take a senior position at a nonprofit that needed her. And then she met Marcus. I should tell you about Marcus because I don't want him to be a cartoon. He's more than that, and the more is the part that matters. Marcus came from money, not old money, new money. The kind his father made fast in real estate development in the late 90s, and that grew into a whole way of looking at the world where price and value meant the same thing. Marcus himself is not unkind. He's smooth and certain, and he moves through spaces as if he's already decided he belongs in them, which I suppose is what confidence looks like when it's never been tested. He married my daughter 18 months after they met, at a venue in Kananaskis that cost more than Roy and I had spent on our first house. I tried. I genuinely tried. But Marcus had a particular way of looking at things that were old or handmade or modest in origin, a slight rearrangement of his face. Nothing you could point to exactly, just a small recalibration, like a man discreetly checking his watch. He'd done it at Christmas when I'd brought my shortbread in a tin I'd been using for 20 years. He'd done it when he saw the cradle in Lily's attic and said, "Well, it's a bit rough, isn't it?" in what he thought was a light tone. He thought Lily found it charming, his certainty that nicer meant better. I don't think she did, but she'd learned, the way people do when they love someone who won't bend, to smooth it over. Roy's box sat on my dresser for a year and a half. I looked at it every morning. I dusted around it. I wasn't ready to give it away yet, and I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but honestly, I think I was also just not ready to let go of the last thing Roy made with his hands. Then, Lily and Marcus announced they were expecting. I knew, the way you know things when you've been paying attention for 67 years, that this was the time Roy had been waiting for. The floor he'd wanted to give her. A new baby, a new city, the costs and exhaustions of a life being built. This was exactly when the account would matter, and the letter, and the locket. I also knew, without anyone having to tell me, that I was not going to simply hand Marcus an envelope and hope for the best. Roy had worked 3 winters in that garage. He'd pressed that lid closed and left me a note and put it safe. I intended to honor that. I packed the box carefully in a canvas bag. I didn't wrap it, because Roy's work didn't need wrapping. I drove to Calgary in the spring because I wanted to make the drive, the way Roy and I used to drive places together when we could have flown, because he said you miss everything at altitude. The plan was to give Lily the box at a quiet family dinner, just the 2 of us plus Marcus, with enough time to go through it properly. Roy's letter, the locket, the passbook, I wanted to walk her through it slowly. I wanted to be there when she opened it and read her father's handwriting and understood what he'd been building all those years in the background of her life. The dinner was supposed to be Sunday. On Saturday, they decided to rearrange the baby's room. Lily's place in Calgary was a newer build, one of those open-concept condos with high ceilings and very little storage. They'd been using the second bedroom as a sort of catch-all, and now that there was a real deadline, it needed to be cleared out and turned into a nursery. Marcus's brother Derek came over to help move furniture. A friend of Marcus's named, I think, Travis, and me because I was visiting and it was an all-hands situation. I had put the canvas bag with Roy's box in it on the floor of the guest room closet when I arrived, tucked in the corner, assuming it was safe there. I should have put it in my suitcase with the zipper done up. I have turned that detail over in my mind many times since. At some point in the reorganization, someone must have gone into the guest closet for something, maybe to move boxes, maybe to make space, and my canvas bag had been picked up and looked at and determined to be part of the general clutter of things to be sorted. Marcus later said he thought it was donations. He said the bag looked like the kind of thing you'd bring to a Goodwill drop-off. He put it in the recycling bin in the parking garage, not the garbage. He was very particular about this later, as though the distinction mattered. The recycling bin. As if Roy's box was a newspaper. I didn't notice it was gone until that evening when I went to set it out on the dresser in the guest room so I'd have it ready for dinner. I moved the clothes. I'd hung in the closet. I looked behind the shoes. I stood there for a moment with the empty space in front of me before I understood. I went and found Marcus in the kitchen. I asked him, very quietly, if he'd seen a canvas bag from the guest closet. He thought about it. He said, "Oh yeah, actually I think I put that with the building recycling. Sorry, I thought it was donations. Was there something in it?" I don't think Marcus had any idea what his face did in that moment. There was no cruelty in it, no deliberateness. It was just the face of a man who had looked at something he didn't recognize and made a fast decision and moved on, the way you do when you're efficient and you've never had to think about the weight of other people's objects. I said, "Yes, there was something in it, a box my husband made." He said, "I can go check. It might still be there." It was. The recycling hadn't been collected yet. He brought it back up and handed me the canvas bag and said, "Sorry about that," and went back to the kitchen, and that was, for Marcus, the end of it. But I stood in the hallway with Roy's box in my hands, and I did the arithmetic of what had just almost happened. The letter. The locket. $31,000 in a passbook, which is a physical document, not something that exists in the cloud, not something that could be retrieved with a password reset. A letter from a man who had been dead for 2 years, written in careful blocky printing, sealed for his daughter. It had been in a recycling bin in a Calgary parking garage for 40 minutes. I did not say anything to Marcus that night. I went to my room, and I sat on the edge of the guest bed, and I held Roy's box, and I thought about him in the garage on those winter evenings, the radio on, the care he was taking. I thought about him writing that note. I thought about $31,000, saved $50 at a time, quietly, without fuss, without anyone knowing, the way Roy did everything he believed in. I said out loud to the empty room, "I've got it, Roy, I've got it." And underneath that, something in me went quiet and decided. Lily called me later that night. She'd noticed my mood at dinner, she said. She asked if I was all right. I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart, but I need to talk to you tomorrow. Just the two of us." She said, "Mom, what's wrong?" I said, "Nothing is wrong. I have something of your father's that's been waiting for the right moment, and I think the moment is here." She went quiet. She knew exactly what I meant. Roy's absence was still something she navigated carefully, like a room she knew had furniture moved in the dark. She said, "Okay. Coffee in the morning?" I said, "Yes, and I'm bringing a box." I should tell you what the next part felt like, sitting at her kitchen table the following morning, with my hands around a mug and Roy's box between us, because it matters for understanding what came after. Lily opened it the way her father would have wanted her to. Slowly, with both hands, pressing the lid just right, so it gave its small exhale of air. She looked at what was inside, and she put her fingers over her mouth. She read the envelope first, for Lily, when she needs it most. She looked at me. I said, "He wrote it about a year before he went into hospital. He didn't tell me what was in it. He just said, put it somewhere safe." She opened the letter. I watched her read it, and I'm not going to tell you what it said, because it was hers, private, between a father and a daughter. But I can tell you that by the second paragraph, her shoulders had come down in a way I hadn't seen since before he died, like something she'd been bracing against had finally released. She read all 2 pages, and then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. She picked up the locket. I told her where it came from, his mother, her grandmother, who died when Lily was 6 and who Lily only barely remembered. Then she saw the passbook. She opened it. She looked at the numbers. She looked at me. I said, "He started it when you graduated. $50 at a time." She set it down on the table very gently, the way you set down something you're afraid might break, and then she put both hands flat on the table and she breathed. She said, "I need to tell you something." She told me about the bag, the recycling bin, what Marcus had done. She said she'd only found out that morning when Marcus mentioned it casually, the way you mention a small inconvenience that got sorted out. "Oh, I nearly threw out your mom's bag by accident. Did she tell you?" He hadn't understood what was in it. He still didn't, really. She said, "Mom, that letter, the locket, if it had been collected." "I know," I said. She said, "Marcus didn't know?" "I know he didn't know." "But Mom, that's Dad." "I know," I said again. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He never would have gone to check if you hadn't asked him. He just would have assumed it was fine." That sentence sat between us for a minute. I said, "I know that, too. Here's what I want you to understand about what I decided, because it's the hinge of everything that followed. I could have been angry at Marcus and let it eat the whole situation. I could have demanded an apology, which honestly I was not sure Marcus was capable of in a way that would have meant anything. I could have handed over Roy's box and let the moment stand on its own and hoped things were different going forward. Any of those things would have been reasonable. But Roy hadn't asked me to hand things over and hope for the best. He'd asked me to put it somewhere safe. And the question I was sitting with, at that kitchen table with my daughter's face, still wet from reading her father's letter, was whether safe had been established yet. I told Lily I loved her, and I loved the baby coming, and I loved that she had Roy's letter now and his mother's locket. I told her the $31,000 was hers and would always be hers, and Roy had saved it for her exactly the way she now knew he had. And then I told her I'd been to see a financial advisor in Guelph before I drove out. I told her I'd opened a TFSA in her name, and I'd had the credit union transfer the funds into it, and I'd named her as the sole account holder. And the TFSA was locked against joint access or spousal default, which in plain language meant the money was Lily's, legally, and only Lily's, in a vehicle that sheltered it from tax and that no one else could reach. Lily looked at me for a long moment. She is too kind to say certain things directly, but she understood what I was also saying. She said, "That's very practical, Mum." I said, "Your father was a practical man." She said quietly, "Is this because of Marcus?" I said, "It's because of what your father asked me to do. He said put it somewhere safe. This is the safest it can be." She nodded. She didn't argue. I think she'd been knowing something for a while that she hadn't been ready to name out loud, and I wasn't going to name it for her. That's not a mother's job. The job is to make sure the floor is there, the way Roy said. What she builds on top of it is hers. We sat for a while longer. She made more coffee. She told me about the nursery, what colors they'd chosen. A pale green, she said, felt calm. I told her about a green Roy had mixed by hand once to paint the garden shed, how he'd spent 2 weeks getting it exactly right. She laughed. She said, "That sounds like Dad. I stayed in Calgary 4 more days. On the last day, I did something I hadn't planned. I asked Lily if she still had the cradle. Roy's cradle. The one from her attic in Guelph, the one Marcus had called a bit rough. She went quiet. Then she said, "We brought it. It's in storage in the building." Marcus thought it was too rustic for the nursery aesthetic. I said, "Will you get it out?" She did. We carried it up together, her and me, which is not advisable for a woman in her 2nd trimester, but she insisted. We set it in the corner of the new green nursery the pale green Lily had chosen, and it looked, I will tell you honestly, exactly right. The maple had aged to a warm honey color. The joints were tight. Roy had built it to last, and it had. Lily ran her hand along the side rail. She said, "He made this the winter before I was born. Mom, he made this before he knew if I'd be a boy or a girl." I said he knew he'd need it. She said, "I want the baby to sleep in this." I said, "I think that's exactly what it was made for." Marcus came home while we were standing there. He looked at the cradle in the corner of the nursery, and he did the thing with his face, the small recalibration. He started to say something about the finish, whether it was safe, whether it met current standards, which is a reasonable thing to wonder, but he'd started from the wrong direction, and Lily turned to him before he got through the sentence. She said, "Roy made this. For me. Before I was born. Our baby is sleeping in it." Marcus looked at her face. He looked at the cradle. He said, "Okay, just that. Okay." I don't know if it was the beginning of him understanding something or just a man reading the room correctly for once. Either way, the cradle stayed. There is one more thing that happened before I left, and it mattered. Marcus came and found me in the kitchen on my last evening, while Lily was on the phone with a friend. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and I could see he was working up to something. I poured him a cup of tea because it gave us both something to do. He said, "I'm sorry about the bag." I looked at him. He said, "Lily told me what was in it. I didn't know. I wouldn't have if I'd known. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you didn't know." He said I should have asked. I said, yes, you should have. He nodded. He drank his tea. He didn't try to fill the silence with more words, which was the wisest thing I'd seen him do. I said, after a moment, Roy built things to last because he thought in long stretches of time. He wasn't in a hurry. He thought about things that hadn't happened yet. He saved for Lily before she needed it and built her cradle before she existed. That's the habit of mind he had. I'm not asking you to be Roy. I'm asking you to understand that some things in this family have weight you can't see from the outside. Marcus said, I think I understand that now. I said, I hope so. For the baby's sake, I hope so. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't resolution. It was the beginning of a conversation that will take years and may never fully close. But it was real, which is more than I'd expected to get from him. And I left Calgary the next morning, feeling something I hadn't felt since Roy died, something that was quieter than hope, but in the same family. Like a window cracked open. I've been home in Guelph for 4 months now. The wrens are nesting on the back porch again, same spot they've used for years. And every morning I have my coffee out there and I tell Roy about it. The cradle is in Lily's nursery in Calgary. Roy's letter is in her bedside drawer. The locket is around her neck, the clasp finally fixed by a jeweler on 8th Avenue who said, this is beautiful work. Who made this? And Lily said, my grandmother, and felt the weight of that truth. The baby is due in 7 weeks, a girl. They've named her Margot Rose. The TFSA is growing, quietly and safely, the way Roy grew everything. I'm knitting Margot a blanket. Pale green, to match the nursery walls. There's nothing hidden in it, no letters, no accounts, just wool and time, and whatever a grandmother pours into something she makes with her hands. I started it in March, and my arthritis has been loud about it some mornings. But I keep going because some things you finish, not because they're easy, but because they're for someone. In the center, very small, so small you'd have to know to look, 2 wrens on a branch, facing each other. Because that's who built this. And some things need a signature. Roy always said the best work is the kind that outlasts the maker. He was right about that, the way he was right about most things he said slowly and only once. The floor he laid for Lily will hold her. The cradle will hold Margot. The letter will hold them both for as long as they need holding. That's what was in the bag my son-in-law put in the recycling bin. Not donations, not clutter. Just a man's whole heart, patient and quiet, and waiting to be found by the right hands at the right time. The right hands found it. That's the only ending that matters.